The auction block creaked under Martha's trembling feet as rough hands shoved her forward into the smoky saloon. Whiskey-soaked laughter echoed off wooden walls, while calloused fingers pointed at her like she was livestock. The auctioneer's voice boomed over the chaos, listing her failures like crimes against nature. Barren as desert sand, gentlemen, but she cooks fine and cleans proper. Martha's eyes found the floor, her wedding ring catching lamplight one last time before they'd strip that too. The bidding started low, cruel voices haggling over her worth like she was a broken-down mare. Then the saloon doors exploded open with a thunderous crack that silenced every drunken gambler in the room. Boot spurs rang against floorboards in steady, deliberate steps. A shadow fell across the threshold, and Martha dared to lift her eyes toward the figure standing there like death itself had come calling. But what happened next would silence the entire prairie. 3 days earlier, Martha had been hanging laundry behind a boarding house when Mrs. Patterson delivered the news that would shatter her world. Her husband's debts had consumed everything, even the modest room she'd called home for 6 barren years of marriage. "County says you got till Friday to settle up, or they'll auction you off to cover what's owed," the older woman had said, avoiding Martha's eyes. "Ain't right, but that's the law for widows with no kin and no children to speak for 'em." Martha's hands had stilled on the wet sheets, her knuckles white against the rope line. She'd known this day might come ever since Doc Henderson had delivered his verdict years ago, the words cutting deeper than any blade. "Some women just ain't built for bearing children, Mrs. Coleman. Ain't nothing to be done about it." Now those words felt like a death sentence echoing in her ears. She'd spent her remaining days walking the dusty streets of Clearwater, watching families she'd never have, preparing for a fate worse than death itself. The boarding house had been her sanctuary, but even sanctuaries crumble when the wolves come calling. The morning of the auction, Martha had found herself kneeling by her husband's grave, running her fingers over the crude wooden cross she'd carved with her own hands. "I'm sorry, Thomas," she'd whispered to the prairie wind. "Sorry I couldn't give you sons to carry your name or daughters to tend your grave when I'm gone." A meadowlark had perched on the cross, its yellow breast bright against the gray morning sky. And for a moment, she'd imagined it was Thomas himself trying to comfort her one last time. But even birds eventually fly away, leaving only silence and regret behind. She'd walked to town with her head high, determined to face her humiliation with whatever dignity remained. The saloon had been packed with men who saw her misfortune as their opportunity, their eyes hungry and calculating as they measured her worth in dollars and labor. Sheriff Morrison had read the legal notices with practiced indifference, his voice cutting through her last shreds of hope like a rusty blade. "By order of the county court, Martha Coleman will be auctioned to the highest bidder to satisfy outstanding debts of $47.32. The number seemed impossibly small for a human life, but debt was debt in a world where women like her had no voice and fewer rights. The bidding had started at $5, each increase feeling like another nail in her coffin. Jake Morrison from the cattle ranch had bid $12, grinning like he'd already broken her spirit. Old Pete from the General Store had countered with $15, his tobacco-stained smile making her stomach turn with revulsion. The saloon owner himself had entered at $18, already calculating how many floors she could scrub and how many beds she could make. Martha had closed her eyes, trying to disappear into herself, when the stranger's boots had echoed across those floorboards. She'd heard stories of men like him, drifters who appeared from nowhere and vanished like smoke, leaving only legends and graves in their wake. But this was no legend standing in that doorway. This was flesh and blood, and something far more dangerous than either. His coat was long and dark, his hat pulled low enough to shadow his features, but she could feel the weight of his gaze settling over the room like a thunderstorm about to break. "What's the current bid?" he asked, his voice carrying the kind of quiet authority that made grown men step aside without thinking twice. $18 for the barren widow, the auctioneer called out, his confidence already wavering under the stranger's stare. The newcomer reached into his coat with movements so smooth they seemed rehearsed, pulling out a leather pouch that clinked with the promise of real money. $50, he said simply, and the saloon fell silent enough to hear heartbeats. Martha's eyes snapped open in disbelief, her breath catching in her throat like she'd been drowning and suddenly found air. $50 was more than most families saw in a year, more than her husband had ever held at one time. The other bidders shuffled backward, suddenly remembering they had other places to be, other business to attend to. "Sold to the gentleman in black," the auctioneer stammered, his gavel falling like a judge's final verdict. The stranger stepped forward, his spurs singing against floorboards as he approached the auction block where Martha stood frozen between terror and hope. But his kindness would soon summon something far greater than gratitude. "You got a name, ma'am?" he asked as he helped her down from the block, his touch gentle despite the calluses that spoke a hard living and harder choices. "Martha Coleman," she managed, her voice barely above a whisper. "And you are?" He tipped his hat slightly, revealing steel gray eyes that had seen too much and forgiven too little. "Samuel Cross," he said, "and I reckon we best be moving along before folks start asking questions we ain't prepared to answer." He led her toward the door, his hand steady on her elbow, but she could feel the weight of every stare following him into the street. Word would spread quickly in a town like Clearwater, stories growing with each telling until truth became legend and legend became myth. Samuel had prepared rooms at the hotel, proper rooms with locks and respect, nothing like what she'd feared when the bidding began. "You don't owe me nothing but honesty," he said as they climbed the stairs, "and maybe someday you can tell me why a woman's worth gets measured by things beyond her choosing." That evening, Martha had found herself sitting across from Samuel in the hotel dining room, trying to understand why a stranger would spend $50 on a woman he'd never met. "You could have bought a good horse for that money," she said, still unable to believe her circumstances had changed so drastically. Samuel had smiled then, the expression transforming his weathered features into something almost boyish. "Horses don't cook as fine as Mrs. Patterson claims you do," he replied. But Martha could see deeper currents behind his humor. "Truth is, I've been watching this town for 3 days, listening to how folks talk about you like you're damaged goods because you ain't bar children." He'd leaned back in his chair, his gray eyes holding hers with startling intensity. "My late wife couldn't have babies neither, and she was worth more than all the fertile women in 3 counties combined." The pain in his voice was raw and honest, the kind that comes from losing something irreplaceable. Martha had felt tears threatening then, but their quiet conversation was interrupted by the thunder of approaching horses, the sound echoing off buildings like distant war drums. Samuel's hand moved instinctively toward his gun as voices carried through the evening air, harsh and demanding. "That's Sheriff Morrison," Martha whispered, recognizing the authority in the shouted commands. "And he don't sound pleased about something." Through the dining room window, they could see torches bobbing in the darkness, men on horseback surrounding the hotel like wolves circling wounded prey. Samuel stood slowly, his movements fluid and ready, while Martha's heart began hammering against her ribs. "Seems your auction has attracted more attention than we bargained for," he said quietly. The hotel owner appeared in the doorway, his face pale with worry and something that looked like fear. "Mr. Cross, there's men outside want to speak with you about the woman. Say there's been some irregularities with the bidding process." Samuel's laugh was dry as desert wind and twice as dangerous. "Irregularities," he repeated, tasting the word like it was poison. But his kindness would soon summon something far greater than gratitude. Sheriff Morrison entered the dining room like he owned it, his badge catching lamplight and his hand resting on his gun butt with practiced ease. Behind him came Jake Morrison, Pete from the general store, and 3 other men Martha recognized as local ranchers and business owners. "Evening, stranger," the sheriff said, his tone carrying all the warmth of a rattlesnake's warning. "Name's Tom Morrison, and I'm afraid there's been some confusion about today's proceedings." Samuel remained seated, his posture relaxed, but his eyes alert like a hunting cat's. "Can't imagine what kind of confusion $50 in gold coin might cause," he replied calmly. "Money's real." The bid was accepted and the transaction's complete. Jake Morrison stepped forward, his face flushed with whiskey and wounded pride. "That woman's been promised to me for weeks," he snarled. "Had an understanding with the county about settling her husband's debts through marriage and labor." The sheriff nodded gravely, as if Jake's claim carried the weight of law behind it. "That's right, Mr. Cross. There was prior arrangements made, legal arrangements that take precedence over any cash transaction." Martha felt the familiar weight of powerlessness settling over her shoulders like a heavy cloak. But Samuel's voice cut through her despair like sunlight through storm clouds. "Seems to me a legal auction trumps backroom handshakes and gentlemen's agreements," he said, rising from his chair with fluid grace. "Unless you're suggesting the county's auction process ain't worth the paper it's printed on." The sheriff's face darkened at the challenge. "I'm suggesting you might want to reconsider your position, stranger. This is a tight community, and outsiders sometimes find their welcome wearing thin mighty quick." The threat hung in the air between them like smoke from a gun barrel, heavy and acrid with a promise of violence. Samuel smiled then, but it was the kind of expression that made smart men step backward and stupid men reach for their weapons. "Appreciate the friendly warning, Sheriff, but I reckon I'll stand by my legal purchase all the same." If you're wondering whether one man can stand against an entire town's corruption, stay tuned, because the answer might surprise you. "There's something you should know about Mrs. Coleman here," Pete from the general store said, his voice oily with false concern. "Woman's got a curse on her, can't bear children to save her life. Ain't natural for a man to pay good money for damaged goods." Martha flinched at the words, each one a familiar wound reopened, but Samuel's response surprised everyone in the room. "Seems to me the only thing damaged in this conversation is your manners, old man," he said quietly. "Mrs. Coleman's worth ain't measured by things beyond her control, and any man who thinks otherwise ain't much of a man at all." The rebuke hit Pete like a physical blow, his face flushing red with embarrassment and anger. Jake Morrison's hand moved closer to his gun, the gesture not lost on anyone present. "You talk mighty big for a stranger," he growled, "but talk don't mean much when you're outnumbered 6-1. Samuel's eyes swept the room, cataloging threats and calculating odds with the ease of long experience. "Numbers don't mean much when most of them are cowards hiding behind badges and false authority," he replied. The tension stretched like a wire about to snap when Martha found her voice for the first time since entering the dining room. "Why?" she asked Samuel, her question cutting through the masculine posturing like a blade. "Why spend your money on a barren woman you don't even know?" The room fell silent, every man present suddenly interested in her answer as much as Samuel's. He turned to face her fully, his gray eyes gentle despite the violence crackling around him like lightning before a storm. "Because my Sarah used to say that kindness ain't about what you get back, it's about what you choose to give forward," he said simply. And because no human being should be sold like livestock, no matter what debts need settling or what arrangements get made in back rooms. His words hit the assembled men like accusations, each one finding its mark in consciences they'd thought were buried too deep to matter. Besides, Samuel added, his voice carrying just a hint of steel beneath the gentleness, "Seems to me a woman who could love a man enough to stay faithful to his grave deserves better than being parceled out to whoever's got the meanest intentions." Sheriff Morrison's patience finally snapped like an overstretched rope, his hand moving to his gun with practiced speed. "That's enough philosophy, stranger. You got two choices here. Sign over your claim to Jake Morrison for what you paid, or we settle this matter another way." The other man tensed behind him, hands moving toward weapons, faces hard with the certainty that justice was whatever they decided it was. Martha felt the world contracting around her, familiar despair closing in like walls of a shrinking cell. But Samuel stood calmly in the center of it all, seemingly unbothered by the odds stacked against him like cordwood. "Sheriff, before you do something that'll haunt your dreams, maybe you ought to know exactly who you're dealing with here," he said conversationally. From his coat, he produced a leather folder that seemed to carry weight far beyond its size. The badge inside caught the lamplight like a star, its surface polished by authority and backed by power that stretched far beyond the borders of any single county. And in that silence, the land itself seemed to hold its breath. "Deputy U.S. Marshal Samuel Cross," he said quietly, letting the badge speak for itself in the sudden stillness. "Been tracking a counterfeiting ring through 3 territories, and my investigation led me right here to Clearwater." The sheriff's gun hand trembled slightly as the implications sank in like stones through water. "Seems there's been some interesting currency flowing through your town lately, Sheriff Morrison. Currency that don't quite match the mint standards I'm familiar with." Jake Morrison's face went pale as milk, his bravado evaporating like dew under summer sun. "Now, I could make this official, call in federal agents. Turn over every rock in this county until I find what I'm looking for," Samuel continued, his voice carrying the quiet authority of unlimited jurisdiction. "Or I could focus my attention elsewhere, maybe decide that Mrs. Coleman's situation was just a fortunate coincidence that brought me to the right place at the right time." The threat was subtle but unmistakable, wrapped in velvet but backed by steel. Pete from the General Star was already edging toward the door, suddenly remembering urgent business elsewhere. "This don't change nothing about prior arrangements," Jake Morrison said, but his voice lacked conviction now, fear replacing anger in his bloodshot eyes. Samuel smiled again, this time with genuine warmth that somehow made him seem even more dangerous. "Actually, Jake, it changes everything," he said. "See, Mrs. Coleman here is now under federal protection as a material witness in my investigation. Anyone who threatens her well-being would be interfering with a federal officer in the performance of his duties." Martha stared at Samuel in amazement, finally understanding that her rescue had been far more complicated than simple kindness. "Course, her testimony ain't needed if my investigation takes me elsewhere," Samuel added meaningfully. "Amazing how witnesses sometimes become unnecessary when local cooperation improves dramatically." Sheriff Morrison holstered his weapon with shaking hands, his authority crumbling like sand in the wind. We didn't realize you were a federal man, Marshal Cross. No disrespect intended." The lie was transparent, but Samuel accepted it with the grace of someone who understood that sometimes dignity mattered more than truth. "None taken, Sheriff," Samuel replied. "Just doing my job, protecting citizens and investigating federal crimes. Mrs. Coleman's situation just happened to intersect with my duties here." He turned to Martha then. "Ma'am, I hope you'll consider accepting my protection until this investigation concludes. Could be dangerous for a witness to be wandering around unprotected." Martha nodded, not trusting her voice to remain steady, but her eyes spoke volumes about gratitude and dawning hope. The assembled men began filing out of the dining room like whipped dogs, their grand confrontation reduced to embarrassed mumbling and averted gazes. Jake Morrison paused at the door, his face twisted with frustrated rage. "This ain't over, Marshal," he said, trying to salvage some scrap of defiance from the wreckage of his plans. Samuel's response was soft, but carried the weight of absolute certainty. "Yes, Jake, it is." The simple declaration seemed to echo in the suddenly empty room, final as a coffin lid closing or a judge's gavel falling. As the last of the men disappeared into the night, Martha finally allowed herself to breathe fully for the first time in days. "You're really a U.S. Marshal?" she asked, still struggling to process the evening's revelations. Samuel nodded, tucking his badge away with the ease of long habit. "Been wearing the star for 8 years, ever since my Sarah passed," he said quietly. Seemed like the kind of work she'd approve of, helping folks who can't help themselves. Martha felt tears threatening again, but these were different from the desperate sorrow that had sustained her through recent days. "The counterfeiting investigation," she began, then stopped, understanding dawning in her eyes. Samuel's smile was gentle but tinged with sadness. "There ain't no counterfeiting ring, Martha. Just a lonely marshal who heard about an auction that turned his stomach and decided to do something about it." The admission hung between them like a bridge across an impossible chasm, honest and vulnerable and completely unexpected. "You spent $50 and risked a fight with 6 men just to save a stranger?" Martha whispered, still unable to fully grasp the magnitude of his gesture. Samuel moved to the window, looking out at the quiet street where moments before had stood the architecture of her destruction. "My Sarah always said the measure of a man ain't in what he takes from the world, but in what he gives to it," he said softly. "Figured I owed her memory at least one good deed that didn't come with a badge attached." Martha joined him at the window, her reflection ghost-like in the glass. But for the first time in years, she didn't look away from her own image. "What happens now?" she asked, the question encompassing far more than just their immediate circumstances. Samuel was quiet for a long moment, considering words that would shape both their futures. "Now, you choose, Martha Coleman. You're free, truly free, maybe for the first time in your adult life. You can go anywhere, do anything, be anybody you want to be." The weight of absolute freedom was almost overwhelming after years of being defined by her failures and limitations. "I don't even know where I'd go," she admitted, her voice small in the vastness of possibility. Samuel turned from the window, his gray eyes holding hers with steady warmth. "Sarah and I had a ranch up in Colorado Territory, good land with a house that's been empty too long. Could use someone to tend it proper, someone who understands that a home's worth ain't measured in the number of children who run through its rooms." The offer was carefully neutral, a gift without strings attached, but Martha could hear the loneliness beneath his words. "You'd trust me with your home?" she asked, amazed at the idea that anyone would have such faith in her capabilities. "Trust you?" Samuel laughed, the sound warm and genuine. "Martha, you survived years of being told you weren't good enough. Stayed faithful to a man's memory, even when it cost you everything, and faced that auction block with more dignity than those men showed in their own homes. I'd trust you with a lot more than just a house and some cattle." Martha felt something shifting inside her chest, a loosening of bonds she'd carried so long she'd forgotten they were chains. "I'd like that," she said simply. I'd like that very much." Samuel's smile was bright enough to light the entire room, hope and possibility flowing between them like water in a desert. "Then it's settled," he said. "Soon as I finish my business here in Clearwater, we'll head north to Colorado. You can start fresh, build whatever kind of life you want." Martha nodded, but something in his voice made her study his weathered features more carefully. "What business?" she asked, sensing undercurrents she couldn't quite identify. Samuel's expression grew serious again, the lawman reasserting itself over the gentle stranger. "Well, turns out there really might be some irregularities in how this county's been conducting its auctions," he said thoughtfully. "Might need to investigate whether other women have been sold off to settle debts that weren't legally theirs to bear." The implication sent a chill down Martha's spine as she realized her situation might not have been unique in Clearwater's recent history. "How many others?" she whispered, dreading the answer but needing to know. Samuel's jaw tightened with barely controlled anger. "That's what I aim to find out. And when I do, there's going to be some federal charges filed that'll make tonight's little confrontation look like a church social." Martha felt a fierce satisfaction at the thought of justice finally reaching men who preyed on women's vulnerability. "I want to help," she said firmly. "If there are other women who've been hurt by this system, I want to help you stop it." Samuel studied her face, seeing strength where others had seen only failure. "Could be dangerous, Martha. Men like Morrison and Jake don't give up easy when their profits are threatened." Martha's smile was sharp as broken glass, years of suppressed anger finally finding a focus. "Marshall Cross, I just survived being auctioned off like livestock. I reckon I can handle whatever dangers come with seeing justice done." The next morning brought news that would transform their quiet investigation into something far more significant than either had imagined. Hotel owner Patterson knocked on Martha's door with information that made her blood run cold. "3 more women been sold off in the past 6 months, he whispered, glancing nervously down the hallway. 2 widows and a girl whose family couldn't pay their taxes. All of them told their debts would be forgiven if they accepted private arrangements with local men." Martha felt sick at the scope of the corruption, but Samuel's reaction was professionally controlled fury. "Where are these women now?" he asked quietly, already reaching for his badge and authority. Patterson's face was grim with knowledge he'd carried too long in silence. "One's working Jake Morrison's ranch, ain't allowed in town without permission. Another's locked up at Pete's store, sleeping in the back room like a prisoner. The third one," he paused, struggling with words that wouldn't come easy. "The third one didn't survive her first winter with the man who bought her. Consumption took her, but folks say she gave up fighting it." Samuel's hands clenched into fists, his marshal's training warring with his human need for immediate justice. "That's murder," he said flatly. "Maybe not with a gun, but murder all the same." Martha placed her hand on his arm, feeling the tension coiled there like a spring ready to snap. "We save the ones we can save first," she said quietly. "Then we make sure it never happens again." Her practical wisdom cut through his rage, focusing it into something more useful than fury. Samuel nodded slowly, his breathing returning to normal as his professional instincts reasserted control. "You're right. We gather evidence, document everything, build a case that'll stand up in federal court." He turned to Patterson, his voice carrying absolute authority. "I'll need names, dates, amounts paid, and locations where these women are being held. This is now an official federal investigation into human trafficking across territorial lines." The scope of their mission expanded dramatically as more information surfaced throughout the day. Martha accompanied Samuel as he interviewed shopkeepers, hotel guests, and anyone else willing to talk about Clearwater's recent changes. The picture that emerged was damning in its systematic cruelty. "Sheriff Morrison's been taking a cut from every auction," revealed the barber, his voice barely above a whisper. "Gets a percentage from the buyers, plus whatever he can skim from the estates before the debts get calculated." A traveling merchant confirmed that similar auctions were happening in 3 other counties, all coordinated through a network of corrupt officials and predatory buyers. "It's bigger than just one town," Samuel told Martha as they reviewed their notes that evening. "This is organized crime operating under the cover of legal proceedings." Martha felt overwhelmed by the magnitude of what they'd uncovered, but also grimly satisfied that her suffering hadn't been meaningless if it led to stopping others from experiencing the same fate. The confrontation came sooner than expected when Jake Morrison appeared at the hotel the next morning, his face twisted with desperate rage and something that looked like fear. "You're destroying everything," he snarled at Samuel, his hand hovering near his gun but not quite touching it. "Years of work, years of building something profitable, and you're tearing it down over one barren woman who ain't worth the trouble." Samuel stood slowly. "The only thing I'm destroying, Jake, is a criminal enterprise that's been hiding behind legal paperwork and community respectability." Martha stepped beside Samuel, no longer the frightened woman from the auction block. "And I ain't the only woman who's been hurt by your profitable system," she added firmly. Jake's eyes darted between them, calculating odds and finding them wanting. "This ain't over," he repeated his familiar refrain, but this time it sounded more like a prayer than a threat. "Actually, Jake, it's more over than you realize," Samuel replied calmly. He produced a telegram from his pocket, the official seal visible even from a distance. "Federal agents are en route from Denver, should be here by Thursday. Seems my preliminary report raised some eyebrows in important places." Jake's face went white as fresh snow, the blood draining away like water from a broken bucket. "You can't prove nothing," he whispered, but his voice carried no conviction. Martha smiled, feeling powerful for the first time in her adult life. "We don't have to prove anything, Jake. You and your friends already confessed to everything when you thought you were intimidating a helpless woman and her protector." The truth of her words hit Jake like physical blows, his shoulders sagging as the weight of consequences finally settled around him. "What do you want?" he asked finally, defeat evident in every line of his posture. Samuel exchanged a look with Martha, silent communication flowing between them like water finding its level. "We want the other women released immediately," Martha said, her voice carrying authority she'd never known she possessed. "We want full restitution to their families, and we want your cooperation in identifying everyone involved in this network." Jake nodded slowly, trapped between federal justice and local consequences. "And Jake," Samuel added quietly, "we want you to understand that if any harm comes to any of these women, if they disappear or have accidents or sudden illnesses, the full weight of federal law enforcement will come down on this county like the wrath of God himself." The marshal's words carried absolute certainty, backed by power that stretched beyond horizons and reached into courtrooms where local corruption held no sway. Jake Morrison's criminal empire crumbled in that moment, reduced to ash by the simple act of one man choosing kindness over profit. The resolution came swiftly once federal authority asserted itself over local corruption. Within a week, 3 women were freed from their forced situations, their illegal sales voided by federal court order. Restitution payments flowed to families who'd been cheated, and arrest warrants were issued for officials in 4 counties. Martha found herself at the center of it all. "Never thought my barren womb would help save other women," she told Samuel as they prepared to leave Clearwater for his ranch in Colorado. Samuel's response was gentle but firm. "Wasn't your womb that saved him, Martha. It was your courage, your refusal to let them define your worth by things beyond your control." Martha felt tears of gratitude and something deeper, something that might have been the beginning of love for this man who'd seen value where others saw only failure. Their departure from Clearwater was witnessed by half the town, but the atmosphere was celebration rather than confrontation. The women Martha had helped free came to see her off, their faces bright with hope and possibility. "Thank you," whispered Mary, the young woman who'd been sold to cover her family's taxes. "Thank you for showing us we're worth more than our debts." Martha embraced each one, feeling connections that transcended their shared trauma. "Take care of each other," she said softly. "And remember, your worth ain't measured by what others say you can't do." Samuel helped her into the wagon, their belongings secured behind them, along with the legal documents that would reshape how 4 counties treated their most vulnerable citizens. As they rolled out of town, Martha looked back once at the saloon where her auction had taken place, but felt no regret at leaving it behind. The ranch in Colorado Territory was everything Samuel had promised and more. A sprawling homestead nestled between rolling hills and distant mountains. The house was larger than any Martha had ever lived in, with windows that caught morning light and rooms that echoed with possibility rather than loneliness. "Sarah designed most of this," Samuel said as he showed her through the rooms. "Always said a home should feel like an embrace, warm and welcoming, and strong enough to weather any storm." Martha could feel the love that had built this place, the dreams and hopes embedded in every board and stone. She had good taste, Martha said softly, running her fingers along a windowsill that had been carved with intricate patterns. Samuel's smile was sad but peaceful. She'd like knowing it was being cared for by someone who understands that a house becomes a home through love, not just occupancy. The months that followed were the happiest of Martha's adult life, filled with work that mattered and companionship that valued her for who she was rather than what she couldn't produce. She tended the ranch with skill born of necessity and refined by genuine care, while Samuel traveled his circuit as a federal marshal, always returning with stories of justice served and wrongs made right. Their relationship deepened gradually, built on mutual respect and shared values rather than passion or convenience. "Seems to me we make a good team," Samuel said one evening as they sat on the porch watching sunset paint the mountains in shades of gold and crimson. Martha nodded, contentment settling around her like a well-worn shawl. "Never thought I'd find my place in this world," she admitted. "Always felt like I was failing at being what everyone expected." Samuel's hand found hers, calloused and warm and steady. "Maybe the problem wasn't with you, Martha. Maybe it was with their expectations." As winter melted into spring, Martha discovered she was pregnant, a miracle that defied medical certainty and challenged everything she'd been told about her limitations. "Doc Henderson was wrong," she whispered to Samuel, her hands pressed protectively over her growing belly. "He was wrong about everything." Samuel's joy was tempered with concern for her health, but Martha had never felt stronger or more certain of her purpose. "Sarah always said that miracles happen when we stop trying to force them and start trusting in something bigger than ourselves," he said, holding her close while their child stirred between them. Martha's pregnancy became a symbol of hope throughout the territory, proof that sometimes the experts are wrong and that worth can't be measured by conventional standards. The birth was difficult but successful, producing a healthy daughter with Martha's eyes and Samuel's stubborn determination. They named her Hope, a testament to the power of believing in possibilities despite overwhelming evidence to the contrary. "Look what came from a woman they said was worthless," Martha whispered to her daughter as she nursed her in the same chair where Sarah had once planned her dream home. Samuel watched them both with wonder, his life complete in ways he'd never imagined possible after Sarah's death. The ranch prospered under Martha's care, becoming a haven for women who needed temporary shelter while legal proceedings restored their rights and dignity. "Seems fitting," Samuel observed, "that a woman who survived being auctioned should provide sanctuary for others facing similar circumstances." Years passed, and Martha's story became legend throughout Colorado Territory and beyond, inspiring changes in laws that had allowed women to be treated as property. She corresponded regularly with the women from Clearwater, sharing updates and encouragement, maintaining connections that transcended distance and time. Hope grew into a spirited child who inherited her parents' sense of justice and their determination to protect those who couldn't protect themselves. "She's gonna change the world," Martha told Samuel as they watched their daughter defend a smaller child from playground bullies. Samuel's smile was proud and knowing. "She already has, just by being born to parents who know that worth comes from within, not from meeting other people's expectations." Martha Coleman Cross lived to see women gain the right to vote, to own property independently, and to be judged by their abilities rather than their biological functions. Her auction block became a museum exhibit, a reminder of darker times and the courage required to change them. She died peacefully at 93, surrounded by children and grandchildren whose existence defied medical predictions and social limitations. Her tombstone bore a simple inscription that Samuel had chosen years earlier. She was worth more than gold, more precious than pearls, and richer than those who tried to measure her value. The words became a rallying cry for women throughout the West, a reminder that human worth transcends circumstance and that kindness can indeed change the world. Would you have risked everything to save a stranger from an auction block, even knowing the fight might cost you everything? The courage to stand against injustice often requires us to sacrifice our own comfort and safety. But sometimes one act of kindness creates ripples that spread across generations. Martha's story proves that our greatest defeats can become our most powerful victories when we refuse to let others define our worth. Subscribe for more powerful stories like this and click on the video on the screen to watch the next one with a twist so powerful you'll never forget it.